So, hello to those of you who don't already know me. I'm Chris. I work for a company called Sonotype, and today I'm going to be talking just a little bit about Node.JS and building CLI tools with it, and why I think it's a good choice for that. And I'm just going to kind of go over at a high level what some of the libraries are that can help you with that, and just some general best practices for building command line tools, and some general Node stuff. Actually, real quick, just to get a feel, hands, like how many people here are JavaScript experts versus JavaScript newbies or intermediate?
A little bit beyond intermediate.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So first off, like CLI user experience, it's still a user interface. So that's just something like you don't often think about, but there's good design and bad design for the CLI, and there's actually kind of a whole world of stuff there. I'll kind of start with that actually. So some things you want to think about when you're making CLI application is just standard Unix conventions. I don't know, everybody probably knows, maybe not, but when you exit a program, you return 0 if success. You can return any other number for failure. And in Node, you can do that with process.exit and pass it something. And I'll show some examples in a minute here. Depending on the type of program here, I'm going to show like 2 ways you can go. So you can do like sort of a standard command line tool where you're going to call the command, you're going to consume some arguments and maybe take some flags, or you can make incursus apps, which have more of a graphical user interface, more like a window in the terminal. And some other things you might want to think about with when you're writing those programs is to pipe your errors out to std error, and to send your standard logs out to standard IO. You can do that in Node with console.error, console.log. Other good things that you might want to look at with Node is it has console.trace, which can help you get a stack trace. Console.time can also help you time your functions. I guess stepping back a bit, why use Node for this stuff? So you can really use anything for this. So, but some of it's stylistic choice. Some of it's like, for example, you could use C++ or something like this, but that's a really big tool for a small job, right? It's just the wrong tool for the job. Now there are other languages that could also be good. Things like Python are used a lot for scripting. But Node is nice because it is JavaScript, so a lot of people already know some JavaScript. It's everywhere. It's basically, I think, pretty intuitive, and it lets you sort of get down to writing pretty quickly. Also, I think it's useful somewhat in this context because JavaScript has traditionally been, is always really single-threaded. Basically the low-level APIs for JavaScript have traditionally been implemented around non-blocking I/O patterns. So basically what that means is anytime you go to do something, request something that is an I/O operation, it's set up such that it's going to call that thing, continue executing your code, and have some mechanism to come back to code of your choice when that's done. Node has ran with that pattern, which was already there in JavaScript, and it's built all of the file system interactions around that. All of any type of web service calls you want to do, all that's going to use that pattern. There's actually multiple different ways to do that in JavaScript now. Now there's multiple patterns for that, but basically the long and short of it is there are a lot of good patterns there you can use. So it makes your life a little simpler if you're going to be doing what I think a lot of command line tools are going to be doing, which is, piping files around, parsing things. let's see. So I don't know, since given what we were just saying there, I'm going to show just some basic Node patterns for file system type stuff. I'll start with that one. So this is a very contrived example, but what I'm going to do here is I have a sources.json here, which is just a file containing some JSON. It just has a couple objects in it that have a name and a URL. And let's say that I wanted to batch through that file and query all the URLs in it and output something about those URLs to the console. One thing I'm using here that even if you are familiar with JavaScript that you may not be super familiar with because it's relatively new is I'm using the async await pattern. How many people know what promises are or familiar with promises? Okay, so most everybody knows that. So how many people have seen the async await pattern? So most people, but maybe fewer people. So basically, it's just I think it was like the logical conclusion of promises. First we got promises, then these were implemented on top of promises, and they make promises nicer. So basically, what you can do is if you have a function that returns a promise. And this is a little bit of kung fu here. In newer versions of Node, you don't have to do this, I don't believe, but in 8.11.1, the fs.read file here. So this is where I'm reading in a file. I want to use this function fs.read file, but in this version Node, that does not return a promise. It uses a pattern which you've probably seen. Let's see here, which is a nice pattern too, but it's just becoming less the way to do things. But often what you'll have is you'll have my async hunc, and then it'll take a function which is your callback, and that function when it's ready, when it's complete, it'll pass back error as the first parameter and then some data, and that's kind of standard old school JavaScript pattern. You still see a lot, still pretty useful. And basically the convention is you always have error be the first thing in your callback, and that just basically makes chaining things a lot easier, and it's just a nice convention to have. But what's going on here is this promisify, which is on util. It understands that pattern of error, and so you can take any function that uses that standard pattern and you can wrap that around it, and you've converted it to something that returns promise. And I guess everybody kind of knows promise, but basically, you know, just to show real quick, that basically look like you're returning, if you're in that function, you'd be returning a new promise, and it's going to have, you know, a resolve and a reject, and then you can basically take the result of whatever that lambda was you passed into run that you're wrapping, and you can check if it got an error, and then you can reject, or you can call the resolve otherwise. So that's all I'm doing there, and basically what that means is that this function here, async read file, is now a version of fs.read file that returns a promise. What that does for us is that lets us use the async await pattern. So basically anytime I want to use the async await pattern, what I do is the outer function here that I'm in, I have to declare that that function is async, and then that now makes this await available to me. So by prefixing this function call with await, it's basically writing on top of that promise interface, and what it's going to do is it's going to return into contents when this function is done the actual result that would come back in my .then clause if this were a standard promise workflow here. One consequence of this that you may be thinking about is, you know, if you're doing standard promises, you're going to have your .then, you're going to have your data, you're going to do some stuff, but you're also going to have a catch usually for error handling. No catch here. So what's that mean? That means that this actually will throw an exception if there is an error in there. And so that's why down here I am wrapping my call to get sources in a try catch. One interesting thing to note, I thought for a long time that try catch in JavaScript was like bad news, don't ever do that. And in fact, that used to be true. The way the JavaScript engines used to work, that used to really throw off the just-in-time compiler and de-optimize your code. But in new versions of V8, that's no longer true. So you can now use try catch, and I believe all the modern JavaScript engines without so much of a problem. So, and in fact, that's now becoming a recommended pattern to use the async await and try catch. So basically what this await does for us too is it basically means that any code after this await, let's go back up here, so this JSON.parse, that's not going to happen until after this comes back. But it's not the same thing as making this blocking either, because it's still an asynchronous call. So if we had some kind of like other code outside of this function, you know, or some type of other events that needed to be processed, those could still happen. But we are basically blocking on this function. We're not doing anything within this function after that await until it's returned. So it can basically, it's a nice way to linearize your code. I still think there are some places to use some of the older patterns. I don't think I put this in my notes, but I'm a big fan of a library called async.js, and it's also a good way to linearize code that uses the old callback pattern with the error as the first parameter. And I think for some certain things it can still be nicer, but for a lot of things this await pattern's the way to go. So basically what I'm doing here, so right here I'm getting the sources. This is just basically reading that file in a non-blocking way, parsing the JSON, and then handling any errors. And then I'm iterating over what I now have is an array of objects, and I'm using map here to basically just return all those as promises, but I'm also handling each of the promises inside of here and console logging it. Oh, here. So that is Axios there too, which is another tool I like to use. Props to Dima for turning me on to that. It's a nice promise aware library for doing HTTP requests, and it's also implemented post Node Revolution, so it's implemented to play nice on both the client and the server, so you can just kind of use that anywhere, and it's out of the box returning promises. So each of these is returning a promise and doing a GET request, and when that GET request repeats, logging the results of that. And then because we've essentially returned, we now have an array of promises and tasks. We can use promise.all here to basically log out something else when we know that they've all been satisfied. So if I could type out. So that pinged my two sources and it logged out the status by default. If I do that, it'll actually log out the HTML. That's just, and this is something else I was going to show. This will skip one of my demos, but so this is kind of the easiest way to get arguments out in Node. So right there I'm doing process.argv, and you'll notice I'm doing 2. That's because in Node, like the first 2 arguments are consumed by the program that you're running. And here I'll show that real quick. So this one just logs out the argument at 0, and you'll see that's just the path to our node application itself, our node and runtime. And then the second one is the path to our program, and then only in that index, the third index there, do you get your actual parameters. Now, so that's how you can consume arguments on the command line, but that's a really dumb way to do it, because obviously, like, what you want thinking about this is you want to provide like lots of different flags. You want to provide alternatives for the flags. So, you know, a common pattern you see is this. You'll have, if you have a flag called timestamp, you'll have a -t, a -- timestamp. You'll want, you know, to be able to print usage. So you can do all that way, just writing all that logic yourself, but you don't really have to. There are a lot of libraries to do that for you. My current favorite is Commander.js, and so I'll show that real quick here. Oh, clicking the wrong window. So, well, first I'll show the program here real quick and what it does, and then I'll show you the code. So this is just another very contrived, stupid program, but and I'll show some more real-world things here at the end, if I can remember my naming conventions. So let's see. So this, you can give it a command called list, and it's going to print out some items. I can give it a command called item and give it an argument, and it's going to print out the argument at that index. I can also give it a -i flag with the item command, and that's going to print the reprint the index there. And I can also, for either of these commands, do, nope, it's timestamps. But that shows you one thing here. So one cool thing here, so that is added a timestamp, but you'll notice if I mess something up, I get an error, which is nice. I'd like it to do that. And you'll also notice, like, so the -i flag for index doesn't apply to my list command because I didn't want it to for whatever reason. So you notice that's also an error if I use it with list. And I can do --help, and I get this nice, here's how you use it. You do demo commander, you do optional flags, you do a command. --version also works. And also, cool thing, with specific commands like item, I can do item --help, and that gives specific help for the item. And what's cool about this is not a lot of code. Type. So got my hard-coded list here. I'm requiring commander here. It's just a timestamp function here for printing the timestamp. But here's basically the meat of this. So this program here is what commander returns. You can tell the version. By default, it'll do tac. You don't actually have to have. So you'll notice, so the standard pattern here is like for an option, you'll do like, you'll specify the two flags that you can use, like the short version and the long version. You can actually leave this off of version, but it will by default do tac uppercase V and tac version, and that annoys me. I like tac lowercase v, so this lets you override that. But basically you can just specify options here, and you'll notice I'm breaking these up, and that's because basically anything that I specify up here, like this timestamp, that's going to apply to all my commands. But anything that I specify in one of these blocks after a command, so let's see, so down here I have this -i --index option that applies only to the item command, and then each of these commands have an action associated with them, and that action is just a function. So I've got those defined down here, and they're pretty simple, but that gives you an idea. So I think that's a really cool library if you're gonna write a tool, like if you're gonna be writing some sort of DevOps application, you know, like maybe you need something in your build environment to parse some files. I don't know. There's any number of millions of things you can do, and it's nice if these programs have a decent interface and print out nice, usage and help me. And having something like this makes that a lot easier and less overhead, so you're more likely to actually do it. Another thing to consider when writing these kind of applications is what you're logging and where and how much and for who. So you want to be able to log a lot of stuff because you need to be able to debug your application, but you also don't necessarily want that showing up for customers. So another really good tool, and I don't even think I have I don't think I included a demo for this, but it's super basic. There's a library just called debug, and you can basically just require npm install debug, and you give it a path like, say, my app name, and I recommend name spacing these behind your app name because a lot of people use this library, so it's nicer if everything's name spaced like that. So inside each component that you wanted to log, you can have these different levels of logging, and then what you do is you just call it like this, and then when you go to run this application, you would do like node./myapp, and you'd set an environment variable. So you could maybe set it on the line there, or you could export it, but you'd set like so you'd set like debug equals, and then you could do like my app name :any, and that's going to output anything that's starts with that my app name namespace. Or you can get more specific and only log the ones there with my comp. And then, as you can imagine, you can pepper those throughout your code in appropriate places with appropriate name spacing, and you can get a pretty robust debugging system. So that's pretty simple. And
you got an extra key up there. I don't know if it's going to let you.
It would, but I wasn't even going to bother running this.
Okay.
Yeah, but yes, thanks. So now you can get, that covers a lot of cases. I think often that's enough, but actually I'll go ahead and show you, I'll skip to the incurses because that gives you a good answer to why you might want to come back and do this other thing. One of many reasons. So incursus is old. It's an API for building GUI-like applications for the terminal. And you probably remember things that look like this. I very fondly remember reading articles in the school library in some system like this that connected to some big database of articles that we could read, and I read all sorts of weird things in there. I remember reading about polymorphism and polymorphic viruses and all sorts of weird stuff in there. I was pushing the limits of what you could actually find on a high school database of articles on computer sciencey topics. And so this thing is still maintained. It's still useful, I think. And there is a nice Node wrapper for it. Let's see, So I was going to say I jotted down on there. I mean, basically this thing has its start back in BSD back in the 1980.
It's good for nostalgia.
Yeah, and it's been ported to just about everything since. And so there's a couple libraries, Node wrappers for this. The most obvious one, which is just called incursus, not so great. The one that I don't know why it's called this, but it is pretty good, is called Blessed. So if you go on NPM and look for Blessed, you'll find this thing, and I've used it in a lot of different projects. I'll first show you the really dumb version I made for this, and then I'll show you one that I was actually making for a real project that is actually more fun. So this one is super basic. All it is it shows that you can draw a box on the console, it actually receives some mouse input, and so you can drag this box around. So that's a GUI in the console. There we go. So a couple months ago, I was between jobs, and I really like the command line, if you haven't noticed, and I was bored, and I was puttering around, and I wanted to read the Fire and Fury EPUB for some reason, and I didn't want to leave the terminal to do that, and I started looking for CLI EPUB readers, and I couldn't find any that I really liked, so I was just bored enough that I was like, yeah, I'm going to make an in-cursus app for that. And then I can like recreate my experience of reading books in the library or at school when I was a kid. So that is now CLIworm. And let's see. Should have some books on here somewhere. What's a good one? Let's look at my Nook DDRM folder, but not that I would DDRM Nook books or anything, because that would probably not be legal. Here we go, Hunter Thompson, Great Shark Hunt. Let's see if it works. All right, I picked a working one. So basically we got, on the left we have our chapter selection, and on the right we have our actual book. You can scroll through it with mouse or with keyboard. Let's see, we got page down. It should in this version do automatic, automatic next chapter. These seem like really basic features, but they weren't in a lot of the ones I looked at, and it annoyed me. But yeah, that's the gist of it. So I built this pretty quickly in a, using Node in this blessed library, and I'll just, let's see. Actually, this one might be easier to open up in an actual. What? New license agreement, huh? Where do you go? Gonna make me scroll all the way through, huh? Okay. Wow, I wonder what happened here. Must have updated. That's libcliworm. Another fun thing about Node and this being JavaScript is I've actually split the functionality of this app out into a couple different packages. So now I'm also using it in a web app I'm building that does the same thing, but in a web app, because why not? So I don't know how much you want to see of this. Any should I show some of this code, or would you? Okay.
Increase.
Yeah. Let's see here if I can view. There should be a shortcut for this, but I'm not remembering what it is here.
It's not Control+?
You would think. What is that? Is there a way to? That's probably not what I want. Yeah, I do not know how to do that on this operating system in this particular application, which is unfortunate. My preferences. I was gonna see if I can find. Let's just see if I can just make the font bigger. Something huge. Let's try that. Is that gonna do it? No, really?
Yeah, if you select OK, you'll reset.
I clicked apply though. I swear this is a great editor. I always talk about how awesome this editor is, but It's failing me now. Maybe I need to be in control mouse wheel. I wonder. So if I had a mouse wheel.
That's what the first thing I saw was mouse wheel.
Oh, here we go. Here we go. Okay, that's what we needed. Control drag. All right. Cool. Might be a little big now, but so I mean, this is using Blessed, same as the other little application there, though I've wrapped a lot of the Blessed stuff in this UI here, so I've kind of compartmentalized things. So the first thing that happens when this loads up is we pull a bunch of stuff out of our utility functions that has to do with parsing out the EPUBs, and there are some libraries for this, but again, I was doing this out of boredom, so I kind of did it myself because I started reading about them. It turns out all an EPUB is a zip file with a bunch of XML and HTML files in it. So if you unzip one of those, you can pretty much read it. Now, with the exception that if you get it from most of the EPUB stores, like if you get it on like a Nook, for example, or a Kindle or something, it's still the same thing, except they've encrypted all the contents of the HTML files, and there's some sort of magic key that somehow or another the application does some kind of handshaking to get to decrypt. Though I will say, because it has to get onto your device to decrypt it, there's usually a way to get that magic key and decrypt those. So basically this looks at that EPUB file, and it does some stuff to basically figure out where the main file is and to extract out the chapters and everything. A lot of this is, there's like an NCX file, and I'm not using async await here. This is just an old school promise chain. I am there though, it's funny. It's a little bit of a mishmash. I was kind of myself getting used to the whole async await promise thing as I was writing this, because I'd been very much steeped in the old callback way of doing things for a while. So you can kind of see where I was learning that pattern. But the magic kind of happens. Let's see. Sorry, this is, so right here is where we instantiate the UI and pass the stuff we've extracted out to that. Assuming we get to that, you'll notice there is some, basically I do some command line parsing, and there are some options to use this in as a more standard tool instead of going into the incursus interface. So you can pass it some flags and have it like just dump the contents of the book to the terminal, or dump out the chapter list. So that's what all this stuff is here. It basically does this run CLI commands, and it determines if you've passed any of those things that would preempt doing the incursus application. And then if there is an error, it'll just log that error out. And like I said earlier, process.exit1, there's an error, so that just tells, like, you know, other Unixy applications and things, if you're like piping this or whatever, that hey, something bad happened, this didn't exit in a normal way. Tells the operating system that. It's a good, nice thing to do. Otherwise, this basically means that this run CLI commands found one of those magic CLI commands and handled it and did everything it needed to do. But otherwise, if not, this is where we go into the code that you saw happening there, the UI. I had a much simpler version of this originally that was easier to demo. I made a YouTube video kind of hacking it together in a day, but then over time it's gotten a little more complicated. But this is the blessed part of it here. And so this can kind of show you like the standard bits of a blessed app. So every blessed app has a screen component. So so basically this is how you declare the screen for a blessed app. So blessed.screen, you can set a title on it, and you'll notice actually, let's see if that, oh actually yeah, so you'll notice my title up there in the terminal title bar is The Great Shark Hunt now. Funny thing though, it doesn't really ever go away until another program resets it.
Can you get the current title before you set it and then set it back when you exit?
Probably so. That'd probably be nicer. So this is just my constructor here setting up a bunch of stuff. This is another thing to point out too. I don't know, like if you aren't totally current on some of the most recent JavaScript ES 2000. I'm not sure if this was 2015 or if this was ES6 stuff or when they introduced this, but I think by 15 I meant 16. But anyways, you now have this nice class syntax here, where you can declare a class and you can extend things. It's a little more like what people may be used to with Java or C# or C++. Under the hood is still prototype-based inheritance, so it's a little bit of a lie, but it does give you some nice syntactic sugar. You can have a constructor, and you can have, like, you know, methods for your instance and stuff, so it's pretty nice. So let's look back at, because of the complexity of this application, it makes it a little hard to pick out just the blessed stuff, but basically we have our create chapter display, so now we've got our screen signed on our class, and then that's just using blessed.list. And so actually it might be nice to just look over here, because I'll show you they have like pretty good documentation, and that's one of the reasons why I really like this library. Oh, and there's a React version. And I think there's a Vue version too. People have made React and Vue extensions on top of this. Let me see if I can find the actual real one though. I haven't tried out the Vue or the React version yet. I was kind of really tempted to for this demo, but I didn't get that far. So here we go. So documentation's nice. It shows you you know how to create a, whoa, we got a little too zoomed. Okay, shows you how to, you know, create like simple interface there, create some boxes. Like I said, main components of any blessed app are you have this blessed.screen, and then you create other items, and then you append those items to the screen. And there's all sorts of items that are supported, and you can basically scroll down this page and it all very inline. They lay out each of the components. It's actually written in a, I'd say it feels very object oriented for a JavaScript library. Everything's like little component classes that extend other component classes, but basically everything hangs off of an element, and then you have all these different things for kind of standard UI components like lists and text areas and stuff that you'd be used to, and makes it really nice for building out an Incursus app like that.
That looks more like a desktop GUI.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think a lot of people have probably seen this, but I'll show this real quick because this is another thing that I did using Blessed. I'm not going to try to run that on this computer because it takes a lot of setup to get it to run, so I'll click the YouTube demo. Oh, that did not go where it was supposed to go. Well, that's... I'll find it real quick. Here we go. So I think a lot of people here have seen this, but for the sake of anyone who hasn't, because this is kind of a bizarre use of Incursus and the CLI. So this is the thing I did for the rules and play gallery hop event. So basically what I'm doing there, I'm going to turn the sound down because I'm probably explaining it in the video. But basically I'm taking images from that webcam in the event space, and I'm live converting them to ASCII art representations, and then refreshing an incursus text area box in there, and pretty close to real time. And yeah, the Blessed library makes a lot of that doable by having a fast enough refresh rate to like update that box with a whole bunch of characters, which is pretty nice. So I'm guessing that's one of the weirder incursus apps that anybody's made, but I'd love to see more. I saw online somebody implemented Conway's Game of Life using Blessed. Let's see here. Oh.
Is the color all the same? You know, mentioned it for the font on the image, or all the text were all the same color, or did you change this?
So yeah, I changed the color on them, and honestly, it's been a while since I've done that, so I can't remember the details of how I did that. There are some good libraries for doing colors in Node, although in that case, if I recall, I was not using any libraries because I was trying to do all that super fast, and so there's actually like little Unix special key codes, like special string characters that you can send out to tell it on the terminal to color certain blocks of text. So I was just interspersing those in there as I was generating the strings. And yeah, that actually was a fun part of it because I had to map to, there's only 256 colors, something like that on the terminal, and I had to map like the full range of colors in my images down to those and trying to decide like basically what shade is this thing closest to isn't like an easy problem. In fact, it's one of my, I've been playing with that problem for a long time. I did an earlier application where I was trying to do that same problem, and I've never found like a perfect way of doing it, but I've got some various stabs at it. But rough approach is generally map them in, 3D space with your RGB coordinate, and you can like measure how close they are to each other, but you get into weirdness because the RGB cube doesn't have all yellows next to all yellows or all blues next to all blues, so it doesn't really map in a continuum of how we see colors. I've heard that I think is it RSV, there's the cylindrical color space. I've heard that might work better, but I haven't tried that yet. But that's basically what I'm doing there. I'm kind of mapping to the nearest neighbor in RGB space. I did some pre-computation for that too. There's trying to remember what the final version used. I did a couple things where I pre-computed some things. I think in that version, the final version, what it does is it doesn't so much pre-compute, but it pre-caches. So it's like the first however many frames will be a little slower, and then it starts to speed up because it starts caching those computations, and that worked better than pre-computing some of that because depending on where you run the application and the lighting that day and the color of the wall or whatever, it tends to see a different range of things. So basically you just let it go, and then it picks up as it goes. So coming back to the topic at hand, one thing you may notice about a incursus app is if something goes horribly wrong, it can be a little harder to show errors. Like just doing console log, I don't have a good demo to show that, but it'll look really ugly. It'll like break your GUI. It'll start flowing over the top of your GUI. You can use incursus to set the contents of errors to certain boxes and things, which is a nice thing to do for the user, but it's not a great thing to do for, say, if you were trying to debug as a programmer or so that's one reason you might want to use something like this Next library. Other reasons might just be for making things a little nicer for like your DevOps team, whoever's managing this app. But basically what you often want is you don't necessarily want to be logging just to the console. You want to be logging out to different file sources, and maybe some combination of both. And again, you can write all that yourself, but there are some great tools that make that really easy. And let's see. Well, I don't need my list there. Basically, there's log4j.s is one that you'll see a lot. So that one's common. That one predates sort of Node. That was a common JavaScript one, and then there's a Node wrapper for it, but I wasn't super impressed with that. Their documentation was spotty, and it was hit or miss as to what things were the same as the standard log4j.s versus the Node version. What I found was a lot better is one called Winston, and let's see. I'll open up my little Winston demo over here. Winston makes this pretty simple. Let's go back up here. Oh yeah, that's what it's supposed to do, but I'm running it not. Okay, so basically with Winston, you can you just require in Winston, and then let's see, I've got a little bit of cruft in here. So it basically has this concept of transporters. So let's see, here's the meat here. Sorry, this line wrapping makes this a little bit ugly here. Here we go. This is what I was looking for. So you declare a new instance of a Winston logger, and you can have multiple loggers if you'd like. A lot of applications, one might be enough, but you might want to break up different loggers that have slightly different behaviors. And then you set a level on that logger. So in my case, I'm either getting that from the environment, from an environment variable called level, or I'm just defaulting it to warn. And then basically you're going to call in that logger. You can call debug, info, warn, error. There's some other things like silly. There's a lot of different built-in log levels. You can also make up your own log levels and define those. So you could have a log level called foobar or whatever. And then you define different transports for those things. So this is a transport for file. And basically what I'm saying here is anything with the log level of info, log to this info.log. And it'll basically be, these things have like a priority level. So it'll really be not just info, but anything like kind of info or greater. So it'll also capture errors. But what it won't capture is debug statements. And then this one has a log level of error, and this is pulling out a separate log that only has my errors. So down here what I'm doing, I'm calling a debug, dev should see me, info can see me, warn bad monkey, error Planet of the Apes level bad monkey. I don't know if that's like really the right animal there for that, but you know. So you see if I run this sort of just normal without any environment variables set, we only see the warn and the error. But if I set my level equal to info, now that transport picks up our info and our warn. And if we go all the way to debug, we should get all the statements. You'll see there too, it's doing some nice colorization for me. And the timestamp, it does not do for console logs. It doesn't do the timestamps in the terminal just by default, but what you can do here is you can create these formatters, and you can kind of overwrite how it formats the string. So I'm just adding that timestamp, but you'll see in the files that's automatic. So you'll see here we also have these log files. So we have an error.log, and that's captured all our errors, and that's, you know, kind of regardless of what level I set the actual application to, because I have the actual app. What I set there on the environment variables is only controlling what I see on the terminal, whereas these are always being logged to these appropriate log files. So all these things just basically make your applications easier to manage and deal with and debug as you work on them. And I think that's probably covered most of what I was wanting to talk about, but if there's any questions or anything you'd like me to come back to, I can do that.
Wow. That's a lot of CLI stuff. So, back to the CLI GUI app.
Yeah.
Have you put it up on the NPM repository?
Oh yeah, so that is one thing that was actually on my list. So how do you publish these things? So that one is available. So if you're using Node, it's really easy to publish things. Some might argue too easy, but basically anybody can push stuff up to NPM.
8.9 weekly down. That's cool.
Yeah. And then you can just npm install -g and npm install -g clyworm, and you're going to install this application. Now I will say, and this is another thing I was going to talk about, this application, if you read the README, it's not super nice because it has an external dependency, because again I was hacking this together in a day, so it actually uses the W3M, which is command line browser, to actually parse the HTML files. Once it finds them, it extracts that the contents from the EPUB, parses all the chapters, and then it finds the relevant HTML files and pipes them into this other application. So npm can't really deal with that. So to actually install this, you need to apt-get or brew install W3M and then npm install clyworm. What is nice though, well, at least for the Linux environments, if I was going to try to do this for the Mac, I'd have to come up with something else, but there's a very nice thing right now, let's see, called snaps, which are emerging. There's a whole bunch of packaging formats which are coming out in the Linux world right now. One of the bigger ones is snaps. So I've actually snapped this, and I don't have this push, so there's a snap store so you can push to, and then you could snap install clyworm and it would do everything including the W3M, but I haven't actually made this one public yet because I'm still working out some kinks with it. But basically you can define a simple YAML file here and build it, and what this does is it creates like a sandboxed version of this application with all your sources packaged. And I don't have that on here, but I've got that running in. Well, that boots. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to pull down all the dependencies you specify in that YAML, including Node, including, in this case, W3M, and it's going to build those. It's going to build your Node project against whatever version of Node you have, and it's going to encapsulate all that into like a virtual file space, and then it's going to expose it on the command line as like just a standard program. So in this case I've specified clyworm, so you could then run clyworm book and it would just work, but it won't have all those other dependencies exposed. They're there, but they're kind of hidden. So so basically, and this is a little bit of an older version of the program because like I said, I was having some troubles with the snap, so that's why this part of the demo got pushed back. But I can show you that it basically works with this older version. So we've got download, so here's an EPUB. There's some stuff that's not in this version, but it's basically working. But what you will notice about this is Node does not exist. W3M does not exist. All those are self-contained inside the snap. And like I said, basically it works a lot like npm. Like if I had published this, it would just be a matter of typing snap install clyworm on any Linux system with snap packages installed, which they pretty much all support it now. It's kind of a cross-platform way to install on Linux.
So are you saying snap, like, it includes all the dependencies within?
You specify it, and they've kind of got a lot of you specify it, and you may have noticed this package is pretty simple, like, because they have a lot of sort of pre-built plugins for specifying things. So like if your app is a Node app, all you really have to do is say plugin Node.js, and then this one's missing it, but if you wanted to specify a specific version of Node, you do like Node-Engine 8.11.1 or whatever version. And then see, I have staging packages, W3M, and basically it's based on like Ubuntu user space, and pretty much anything that you can apt-get install, you can tell this you need it, and I think you can get pretty sophisticated with it too and actually build dependencies and include them that way, but I've only just sort of started scratching the surface of this, but yeah, so that's a good way to publish those and push those around. Let's stop this before I fill up my hard drive. Sir, beers?
Beers.
Everybody doing beers?